Marquis de Sade. The Marquis de Sade was an 18th century French aristocrat, philosopher, and writer who spent roughly 32 years of his life imprisoned for sexual crimes that shocked even the libertine society of pre-revolutionary France. In 1772, he was convicted of sexual assault, sodomy, and poisoning prostitutes with Spanish fly aphrodisiacs during an orgy in Marseilles, leading to multiple incarcerations in the Bastille prison, Vincennes fortress, and later the Charenton insane asylum. During his long imprisonment, de Sade wrote some of the most extreme and graphically violent works in literary history. His novel, 120 Days of Sodom, was written around 1785 on a 12-meter scroll in microscopic handwriting while he was locked in the Bastille, and it depicts 4 wealthy libertines who systematically torture, rape, and murder their victims over 120 days in elaborate cataloged detail. Justine, published in 1791 under a pseudonym, follows a virtuous young woman who is repeatedly sexually assaulted and abused despite her goodness, presenting a cynical philosophical inversion of moral tales. Both works were immediately condemned, and copies were publicly burned by French authorities. Napoleon Bonaparte personally ordered de Sade's arrest in 1801, declaring his works abominable, and had him permanently confined to the Charenton asylum, where he died in 1814. The books remained banned in France until 1957, and in Ireland until 1967. De Sade's name became the root of the psychiatric term sadism, and his works sparked centuries of debate about whether extreme pornographic violence can constitute literature or should be suppressed as harmful obscenity. Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was a celebrated Irish playwright, poet, and wit whose brilliant career was destroyed when he was convicted under Victorian England's gross indecency laws for engaging in consensual homosexual acts. In 1895, after losing a libel case against the Marquis of Queensberry, Wilde was arrested and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor in Reading Jail, one of Britain's harshest prisons. His name was legally erased, and he became known only as prisoner C.3.3, his cell number. During his imprisonment, Wilde wrote a 50,000-word confessional letter to his former lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, exploring themes of suffering, betrayal, spirituality, and art. This letter, later titled De Profundis, was not a traditional book, but rather an extended meditation written on prison-supplied paper. The manuscript was held by the British Museum with restricted access until 1960, and the first published version in 1905 was heavily censored, appearing 4 years after Wilde's death in poverty-stricken exile. The complete uncensored text was not published until 1962, over 60 years after his imprisonment ended. While De Profundis itself faced restrictions rather than outright bans in most jurisdictions, Wilde's works more broadly were censored, and his name became synonymous with criminal deviance in the decades following his conviction. The case became a landmark example of state persecution based on sexuality and exposed the brutal conditions of Victorian prisons. Wilde died in Paris in 1900 at age 46, broken by his imprisonment and social exile, but his literary reputation was gradually rehabilitated in the 20th century. Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was the Nazi dictator responsible for World War II and the Holocaust who wrote his political manifesto, Mein Kampf, while imprisoned for treason, following his failed beer hall putsch coup attempt in Munich. In November 1923, Hitler and his followers tried to overthrow the German government, and he was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, though he served only 9 months due to political pressure. During his comfortable imprisonment in a private room with visitors and secretaries, Hitler dictated his book to Rudolf Hess, originally titling it 4.5 Years of Struggle Against Lies, Stupidity, and Cowardice. Published in 2 volumes in 1925 and 1926, the book outlined his virulent anti-Semitism, his concept of Lebensraum or living space for Germans, his belief in Aryan racial supremacy, and explicit plans for future territorial conquest. Before Hitler took power in 1933, the book sold approximately 240,000 copies, but after he became chancellor, it became essentially mandatory reading in Nazi Germany, with over 12 million copies distributed by 1945. After World War II ended, Allied forces banned the book throughout Germany and Austria. The German state of Bavaria held the copyright until it expired in 2016, 70 years after Hitler's death, and used this control to prevent reprints and suppress distribution. The book remains banned or heavily restricted in several countries today, including parts of Russia, while nations like France and Austria allow it only with historical annotations to prevent its use as neo-Nazi propaganda. Jean Genet. Jean Genet was a French novelist, playwright, and poet who spent much of his life as a career criminal, repeatedly imprisoned for theft, burglary, and vagrancy across Europe during the 1930s and 1940s. Abandoned at birth and raised in foster care, Genet began stealing at age 10 and spent his youth cycling through reform schools and prisons in France, Spain, and other countries. While imprisoned in Frasnes prison in 1942 during the Nazi occupation of France, Genet wrote his first novel, Our Lady of the Flowers, on brown paper bags supplied by the prison, creating a homoerotic, transgressive work that celebrated the lives of criminals, prostitutes, and drag queens in the Parisian underworld. Prison guards discovered and destroyed his manuscript, but Genet rewrote the entire novel from memory. The book was published in a limited underground edition in 1943 and depicted explicit homosexual acts, criminal lifestyles, and prison sexuality in poetic, vivid language that shocked authorities. It was banned in the United States until 1963 for obscenity and faced similar bans in the United Kingdom and other countries. By 1948, Genet faced life imprisonment as a repeat offender after his 10th conviction for theft. However, leading French intellectuals, including Jean-Paul Sartre and Jean Cocteau, petitioned the President of France, and Genet received a pardon in 1949. Sartre later wrote a 600-page philosophical analysis titled Saint-Genet, examining how the criminal transformed himself into a literary artist. Genet's work influenced the Beat generation and queer literature, while raising questions about whether art created in prison could redeem a lifetime of crime. Eldridge Cleaver. Eldridge Cleaver was an American writer and Black Panther Party leader who wrote Soul on Ice, a collection of essays composed while serving time in California's Folsom and San Quentin prisons for assault with intent to murder following a 1958 shootout with police. During his 9 years of incarceration, Cleaver wrote essays exploring race, masculinity, sexuality, and the prison experience in America, creating a book that would become required reading in many university courses despite containing deeply disturbing admissions. In the text, Cleaver explicitly described how he systematically raped black women as practice before moving on to rape white women, which he characterized as an insurrectionary act against white supremacy and racism. The book was published in 1968 by McGraw-Hill and became an immediate bestseller, praised for its unflinching examination of racism and the criminal justice system. After his release from prison, Cleaver became the Minister of Information for the Black Panther Party, but he fled to Cuba and then Algeria after being involved in another shootout with Oakland police. Soul on Ice was banned in some prison systems across the United States, despite being a book about the prison experience itself, and it was challenged in schools for its explicit sexual content and inflammatory racial language. The book's legacy remains deeply controversial, particularly in the context of modern movements against sexual violence, as it documents unrepentant sexual predation presented within a framework of political revolution. Cleaver later renounced the Black Panthers, became a born-again Christian, and shifted toward conservative politics before his death in 1998, but he never adequately addressed his admitted crimes against women. Jack Henry Abbott. Jack Henry Abbott was an American career criminal who spent most of his life from age 12 in various institutions and prisons before his eloquent letters about prison brutality were published as In the Belly of the Beast in 1981, only to murder someone 6 weeks after being paroled. Abbott was first incarcerated at age 14 and convicted of forgery in 1963, but while serving that sentence, he stabbed and killed a fellow inmate, adding decades to his prison term and spending much of his sentence in solitary confinement. While imprisoned, Abbott began corresponding with author Norman Mailer, who was researching prison life for a book, and Abbott's articulate, powerful descriptions of the violence and dehumanization within America's prison system impressed Mailer enough that he advocated for both the publication of Abbott's letters as a book and for Abbott's parole. Random House published In the Belly of the Beast to widespread critical acclaim from the New York Times, Village Voice, and other outlets, with reviewers praising Abbott's raw, unflinching prose. Partly due to Mailer's advocacy and the book's literary success, Abbott was granted parole in June 1981. However, just 6 weeks after his release, on July 18, 1981, Abbott stabbed 22-year-old aspiring actor and waiter Richard Aden to death outside a New York restaurant following a minor dispute about bathroom access. Abbott fled but was captured and convicted of manslaughter, returning to prison where he died by suicide in 2002. The case severely damaged Norman Mailer's reputation and sparked intense debate about intellectuals romanticizing violent criminals and the gap between eloquent prison writing and the reality of violent behavior. Carol Chessman. Carol Chessman was an American criminal who spent 12 years on death row at San Quentin prison and became an international cause célèbre by writing 4 books from his cell while fighting for his life, though he was ultimately executed in 1960 despite worldwide pleas for clemency. Convicted in 1948 on 17 counts, including kidnapping, robbery, and forced oral copulation as the so-called red light bandit, who impersonated police officers to rob and sexually assault victims, Chessman received the death penalty under California's Little Lindbergh Law, despite never killing anyone. He taught himself law in prison and filed his own appeals, becoming an articulate advocate against capital punishment while maintaining his innocence and claiming mistaken identity. His first book, Cell 2455, Death Row, published in 1954, became an international bestseller, translated into multiple languages, presenting his autobiography and legal arguments in compelling prose that raised serious questions about due process and the death penalty. The book was banned in some American jurisdictions under the principle that criminals should not profit from their crimes. Though it circulated widely, Chessman's case attracted support from Eleanor Roosevelt, Aldous Huxley, and other prominent figures who petitioned California Governor Pat Brown for clemency. His execution was delayed 8 times through legal appeals, and his final stay of execution was reportedly delayed by a phone malfunction, arriving just minutes too late. On May 2, 1960, Chessman was executed in San Quentin's gas chamber after 12 years of highly publicized legal battles. His case significantly influenced the death penalty abolition movement, and California suspended capital punishment in 1967, partly due to controversies his execution raised about justice and state killing. Malcolm X. Malcolm X was one of America's most influential civil rights leaders, whose posthumously published autobiography became required reading in universities, despite being banned in many prisons, creating the ironic situation where a book about prison transformation and self-education was prohibited in the institutions that most needed such stories. Born Malcolm Little in 1925, he became involved in crime during his youth in Boston and Detroit, engaging in drug dealing, prostitution rings, burglary, and armed robbery. In 1946, he was convicted of burglary, breaking and entering, larceny, and firearm possession, receiving an 8 to 10 year sentence, and serving 7 years in Massachusetts prisons, including Charlestown and Norfolk. During his imprisonment, Malcolm underwent a profound transformation after converting to the Nation of Islam, becoming a voracious reader who spent countless hours in the prison library, educating himself in history, philosophy, and religion, After his release in 1952, he rose to become the Nation of Islam's most prominent spokesperson and a powerful voice for black empowerment, though he later split from the organization. Malcolm was assassinated on February 21, 1965, and The Autobiography of Malcolm X, co-written with Alex Haley based on extensive interviews, was published 8 months later. The book extensively detailed his criminal past without glorification, showing his journey from street hustler known as Detroit Red to one of the most articulate advocates for racial justice in American history. Despite being fundamentally a story about rehabilitation through education and spiritual conversion, the autobiography was banned in numerous American prisons for allegedly promoting violence and radical politics, and it was challenged in schools for its language and confrontational discussions of racism. Edward Bunker. Edward Bunker was an American author and reformed criminal who became the youngest inmate ever held in California's San Quentin prison at age 17 and spent approximately 18 years incarcerated across multiple institutions before transforming himself into a celebrated crime novelist, screenwriter, and actor. Born in 1933, Bunker entered the foster care system at age 5 and was first sent to reform school as a child, beginning a cycle of incarceration that continued through his teenage and adult years for crimes including burglary, robbery, drug dealing, and forgery. He escaped from custody at least once, adding time to his sentence, and served hard time in California's most notorious maximum security prisons, including Folsom and San Quentin. While imprisoned, Bunker educated himself extensively and began writing seriously, channeling his intimate knowledge of criminal life into fiction. After his final parole in 1972, he never returned to prison, instead building a successful career as a writer. His first novel, No Beast So Fierce, published in 1973, was a semi-autobiographical story about ex-convict Max Dembo struggling to stay straight after release, and some critics called it the best crime novel ever written for its authentic, unflinching portrayal of criminal psychology and the impossibility of genuine rehabilitation in an unforgiving system. The book was adapted into the 1978 film Straight Time, starring Dustin Hoffman, with Bunker co-writing the screenplay. His novels were occasionally banned in prison libraries for their detailed descriptions of criminal methodology and prison life, though this censorship was inconsistent. Bunker went on to act in films including Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs, where he played Mr. Blue, and became a Hollywood crime consultant before his death in 2005. Iceberg Slim. Iceberg Slim was the pseudonym of Robert Beck, an American author and former pimp who wrote Pimp, The Story of My Life in 1967, a raw autobiographical account of his 25 years controlling women in the sex trade across Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland that became an underground bestseller despite being banned in schools and libraries for its graphic depictions of violence, sexual exploitation, and misogyny. Born Robert Lee Maupin in 1918 and later taking the name Robert Beck, he was abandoned as a child and turned to pimping in the 1930s, a criminal enterprise he pursued for decades while being imprisoned multiple times for pandering, vice crimes, and assault. Beck reportedly controlled up to 5 women simultaneously, using psychological manipulation and physical violence to maintain control over them. He left the life in 1961 after his final prison term and worked as an exterminator, while his wife encouraged him to write about his experiences. Initially self-published, Pimp was picked up by Holloway House in 1967 and sold over 6 million copies through word of mouth in black communities, written in vivid street language that documented the brutal mechanics of sexual exploitation without apology or redemption narrative. The book was banned in many schools and libraries for its explicit sexual content and degrading portrayal of women, and it faced repeated challenges from parents and educators who objected to its misogynistic content being presented as authentic cultural testimony. Despite or perhaps because of its controversial nature, Pimp profoundly influenced hip-hop culture, with artists like Ice-T and Ice Cube deriving their names from Slim's nickname, and rappers frequently referencing his work. His legacy remains deeply contested, between those who see the book as an important documentary of urban poverty and systemic racism versus feminist critics who argue it glorifies the trafficking and abuse of women. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.